Hi, it's Tim Grant.
And Nicci MacLeod from the Right and Wrongs podcast. Unusually for Righting Wrongs, this episode contains no particular content warnings. There is, however, a very, very brief mention of another case involving sexual abuse.
Our discussion will, as always, include an in-depth analysis of how forensic linguistic techniques can play a role in unravelling the truth behind the story.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Righting Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics. Season 2, Case 3. Fake News at the New York Times. The case of Jayson Blair.
Hello, and welcome to Righting Wrongs, the podcast from AIFL, the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We're all about improving the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. I'm Professor Tim Grant.
And I'm Dr. Nicci MacLeod, Deputy Director of AIFL.
So Nicci, this episode is a little different from the normal cases that we tackle. Would you like to tell us a bit about it?
This episode is not about a specific case where forensic linguistic evidence in fact played a role. But what we're talking about here is a case where language analysis could have played a role. So it's kind of being applied sort of post hoc, but we're talking about a kind of a specific case where we could have involved ourselves. So the publishing and detection of fake news is something that is obviously a massive social issue. It's something that that we all know about. It's a very sort of high profile issue. And this particular case, here we're going to look at how a linguistic approach to detecting fake news can make a difference to this social problem. So, Tim, we're going to get into some of the specifics. So what are the news stories behind this particular case?
So as our title suggests, the case is about the New York Times, obviously a high reputation newspaper of record in the United States. And we're looking at how in the early 2000s, they came to publish a series of articles which turned out to be untrue or plagiarised in various senses could be labelled fake news. Worse than this, where the articles were untrue, the journalists writing the articles knew they were untrue. So you could understand a journalist making a mistake, but this is fake news.
So this is the difference between misinformation, which is a mistake, and disinformation, which is deliberate. Yes,
and we're going to get into that in some detail in the course of this podcast. And it was a big scandal at the time and severely damaged the reputation of the paper. And although the analysis, as you said, that we're looking at today, which was done by our guest, who we'll introduce in a moment, was after the fact, it shows how language analysis can be used in this domain to detect and prevent similar cases in the future. And to find out more, let's open the case file.
Jayson Blair was at the New York Times, aged just 23 in November 1999, having been talent scouted from an internship. He was both highly productive and charismatic, and this led to his rapid promotion and key assignments. In 2002, Blair was tasked with covering the DC sniper attacks, a series of shootings across Washington, D.C., in which 7 individuals were killed and 3 seriously wounded. It became the biggest news story in the country, and Blair wrote several front-page features and was also assigned to lead coverage on the trial. In March 2003, Blair was also assigned to report on the domestic stories from the Iraq War. Most notably, he covered the story of Jessica Lynch, an American soldier who'd famously been captured and then rescued in Iraq. In recognition of his accomplishments, his editors at the New York Times were considering promoting him once again in April 2003. Although they made the front page, Blair's articles on the DC sniper were highly controversial, attracting criticism from both inside and outside the Times. In his first front page article, citing anonymous sources, Blair implied that tensions between law enforcement agencies had led to the interrogation of the main suspect being cut short, just as he was about to confess, a claim that was vehemently denied by government officials. In another front-page article, once again citing anonymous sources, Blair reported the other suspect had been the primary shooter, leading to the prosecutor from Virginia calling a press conference to publicly reject his claims. These issues led to internal scrutiny of Blair's work and increasing concern from his editors at the New York Times. Blair, however, continued reporting. His coverage of domestic stories arising from the Iraq War also attracted criticism. Another young reporter, Macarena Hernandez, noticed a front-page article by Blair contained very similar details to her front-page article in the San Antonio Express-News, published on the 26th of April 2003. In response, the editor of the Express-News sent an email to Blair's editors at the Times alleging plagiarism. The Times immediately started an investigation, but before this could get started, the Washington Post broke the story on the 30th of April. Blair resigned the next day, and after a rapid investigation, the New York Times admitted that since October 2002, 37 of their articles authored by Jayson Blair had been plagiarised or fabricated.
So that's the case file.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating case. So, to discuss the language of fake news, and in particular this New York Times case, we have with us today Professor Jack Grieve of the University of Birmingham. Welcome, Jack.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
It's really good to see you, Jack. So
Good to
Jack
be here.
is Professor of Corpus Linguistics at the University of Birmingham, across the city from us at Aston University. Until 2017, he worked with us here at the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics, which was then the Centre for Forensic Linguistics, before taking up his professorship at the University of Birmingham. His research broadly uses computational approaches to analyse language variation and change, and he has applied his insights from this area to forensic linguistic research and casework, most notably in the area of authorship analysis. In terms of casework, Jack and I were jointly awarded our Director's Commendation from the UK National Crime Agency, which is a little like the American FBI, for our combined work on the investigation which led to the arrest and successful prosecution of Matthew Folder, an individual responsible for internet-facilitated abuse of hundreds of children and adults. Perhaps we'll discuss that case in a future episode of Righting Wrongs, but today we're here to discuss fake news at the New York Times. And Jack, with his co-author Helena Woodfield, have a book, The Language of Fake News, which discusses this case. You can find the book online, it's free to download, and we'll link it from our show notes. So welcome, Jack.
Thanks, Tim.
So, Jack, we've heard the case file there outlining the events at the New York Times. What drew you to study this particular case in the first place?
Well, so we were really interested in fake news, and there'd been a lot of recent work on it. It had been a big deal, especially like around the 2016 election. And so I just remembered this from when I was a teenager, that this had been a big controversy. And it seemed like a unique case because it was one where both the newspaper and the journalist had admitted to this. So in this way, it was much more controlled than what was usually being done, where we had a bunch of text. I knew there was a bunch of text out there from a single author, where some were fake and some were true.
Mm-hmm. So why was fake news of such interest to you?
Yeah, so it was just around this time, right after the U.S. election, where Trump had beat Clinton, and this had become a big issue around fake news. And then also just academically, there was a ton of work, especially in natural language processing, on fake news, and it all seemed kind of flawed to us. The big problem was just that they were generally comparing real and fake news that weren't otherwise comparable. And so then they would say, oh, well, look, we can identify the fake news. But it was clear, I think, to any linguist that they were just identifying like blogs, as opposed to New York Times articles or something like that. So yeah, those are the reasons. It'd been big in the news, and then all this work.
So the book came out in 2023. So 4 or 5 years prior to that, you'd got interested in this idea of fake news, and you'd remembered back to the New York Times story of the early 2000s. So that set it up. Let's get a bit of a grip on the data here. So can you run through a little how many stories there were that were known to be fake, what the comparison was? What's the corpus that you're working with here?
Yeah, so I think, like you said, Jayson Blair started in 1999 or something like that. So the New York Times, once the allegations came from Hernandez from San Antonio, and then from the Washington Post, they started this big investigation, but they didn't run all the way back to 1999. They ran back to this sort of 6-month period. I think it was in 2003. And so they ran back on 73 articles over that period. These were articles while he was mostly at the National Desk, I believe. And they did like an article by article analysis, checked sources on every one. They had like 5 or 6 reporters working on it. And so what they then ended up doing was going back and flagging on the record. It was 37 of these articles out of 73 were identified as fake, plagiarized, or in some way faked. And then 36 of them were not flagged. And those 36 then are the ones that were validated, essentially. Although they really invalidated more than validate.
Okay, so let's run through that slowly. So we've got a roughly a 6-month period where there is maximum suspicion.
Yep.
And within that 6-month period, there's a total of 73 articles produced by Jayson Blair.
That's right.
And so this investigation team within the New York Times has basically sorted those into the 2 piles of ones that they still have confidence in and ones which they then publish within the New York Times.
Yep.
These are the bad articles. And that's
right.
Bad means they might be have no source behind them. They might be made up, but some of them are also just plagiarized, or there's other versions of that.
Yeah, I mean, in general, the plagiarized were ones where he was plagiarizing but also lying. So he was saying he had gone and interviewed someone, and rather he had read another newspaper and plagiarized the information from there. So I think they weren't simply plagiarized.
Okay. So that's good. So and you do a little bit of selection and cleaning the data.
We just removed ones, I think, that were under 300 words long.
Okay.
So we removed very short articles because the main analysis is based on measuring the frequency of different types of grammatical features. And as these articles get very, very short, you don't have much to go on. And you have a lot of sort of noisiness in those measures. So that's what happened. We just cut out a few of them that were too short.
Okay, so that's good. And so you were left with a final corpus of, it says here, 64 articles, which enable you to perform this comparison between the known to be good and the known to be fake news articles.
Yeah, so the real and the fake news, yeah.
We were talking a little bit there about kind of good and bad articles, and in the book you develop quite a kind of distinctive taxonomy of what's meant by good and bad news. And obviously that's very important when we're thinking about contrasting between real news and fake news. Can you explain that distinction a bit?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't call it good and bad news. I'm not sure the real news is all good necessarily, but between real and fake news, right? Yeah. The taxonomy we show or that we introduce is a way of trying to distinguish different types of real and fake news. And real news is what you'd think, which is, news that's supposed to inform you, and that is true, or at least considered to be true at the time. But the thing we try to point out in the book is that a lot of the research that had previously been done on fake news really focused in on true versus false news, often based on data collected by fact checkers, right? So you would go and go to a fact-checking website, you grab a bunch of things that have fact-checked false, that would be your fake news, and then usually these websites don't give you true news, so you then go find some news that you would assume is true from places like the New York Times, and then do a comparison. And so that's not always how people think about fake news, right? Lots of news gets fact-checked incorrect all the time. In any newspaper, they regularly publish corrections, and those are not generally considered fake news, or at least not serious fake news, and probably not fake news by the newspaper, right? And so what we argue is that really when we're talking about fake news, or at least when we're talking about the most serious type of fake news, we're talking about news that was or things that look like news that were trying to deceive you, or that were purposely untrue. Right. And so we draw this distinction between inadvertently false, or when someone's not trying to tell you something that they believe is true, and when they're telling you something that they believe is true. And so we draw a distinction between intending to inform and intending to deceive. And that's the basic distinction we make.
I'm really interested in this idea of detecting deception from language. And I remember several months ago, we were both presenting forensic linguistic research to a government agency. And I said that, we can't tell if someone's lying through their language. And then you got up and gave the next talk and said, well, I think we can because of this work, which is great. So I think for me, there are different forms of deception here, or potential deception here. And I think that when you see studies to detect deception from the verbal or textual evidence, people mean all sorts of different things by lying. Yeah, what does lying mean? What does deception mean? So in this case, it's a sort of passing off, isn't it? It is a deception because you're saying this is the same as real news and it should have all the features of real news. And I'm giving it to you as if it's real news. Is that different from other sorts of lies, do you think? So if you ask me for an alibi and I say that I was with my wife all night or something like that, that might be a lie in a certain circumstance. Is all deception the same, or is this a really particular form of deception, do you think?
Well, I mean, I guess in this context, we're interested in deception in the news. But I think in general, deception would be, providing information as if you believe it is true when you don't believe it's true. And I guess crucially, a point we try to make in the book is that this is independent from whether something is or is not true. That, the truth of something, veracity, is something that is, aside, I guess, from people's feelings and things are external to what they think, right? And people believe things to be true that aren't true, and we wouldn't call that deception, right? Like if you say you sincerely believe something, they're not trying to deceive you. They might be wrong. And then when we try, and that's an important distinction in fake news, right? Because you get these corrections all the time where journalists make honest mistakes. Maybe they put an extra zero or something by mistake. That's not a deception. That was an error. And similarly, they might get deceived themselves, right? So quite often, presumably, journalists who get things wrong were simply either given wrong information, either purposely or unpurposely, by a source. And so again, we wouldn't call that deception, at least from the journalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I'm not sure about more generally. I think in general, deception is that you have to have some intent to deceive, or at least you have to believe that what you're saying is untrue.
Okay, so you've got true and false as one category, and then you've got honest and dishonest in intent to deceive is the words you've just used. So this idea of communicative intent then becomes really important, doesn't it? And you use that idea to help you situate this problem of fake news. You use the idea of this form of communication where there's intent to deceive as an issue of what you call register variation. So we've talked a little bit about register variation in other episodes of Writing Wrong. So we've talked about higher and lower register language, meaning probably more or less formal, more or less educated, and so on, which is one form of register variation. It's not a very technical idea of register variation, but it's in usage amongst linguists. What do you mean by register variation? Can you gloss that for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that would be register variation. So to me, register variation is a variation in language use, depending on the context in which language is produced. So, right now we're doing an interview, that would be one type of register. Giving an email would be another. Having a casual conversation would be another. So it's different varieties of language that are defined by the communicative context, the communicative purpose, and they can be distinguished from varieties of language that are defined by like the social background of a person, which we call dialect variation. And so there's a sort of a basic distinction between dialect variation and register variation. And obviously, I speak Canadian English, you guys speak in British English, so there's dialect variation here, but we're in the same register, or there's some kind of, we're broadly in the same register, although you're the interviewers and I'm the interviewee. Yeah. So there's some difference there too. And those would all have differences on our language use, right? So like you guys are probably asking more questions than I'm asking.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, sure. Except you just asked one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is nice. So, and obviously register variation has been well studied in linguistics, and a lot of your work, not just this work, is sort of situated or starts from another linguist called Douglas Biber, who you've worked closely with over the years. And so he has a method of measuring register variation, what have become known as the dimensions of register variation. So would you just like to introduce that idea of how register can break down into these different dimensions?
Yeah, so, I mean, what's been noticed, right, is, so in this interview, for example, right, like I said, you will be asking, I mean, it's not that I didn't ask any questions, as you pointed out, but you'll ask more questions than I'll ask, right? And so there's some kind of, not absolute difference here where I don't ask any questions and you only ask questions, but there'll be a frequency difference. You'll ask them more at a higher rate than I do. And then the sort of basic observation here is that there'll be a bunch of linguistic features that will differ here between us in this interview. They're not immediately obvious to me what they are, but some other examples would be like if we were telling a story, we'd have lots of past tense verbs. right?
Yeah.
But we'd also have lots of third-person pronouns like he, she. We'd have lots of what Doug calls public verbs, words like say. And so the idea of dimensions of register variation is that these underlying dimensions like narrativity or being informative or...
We probably need to explain narrativity. So
Yeah.
the telling of stories.
The telling of stories, giving instructions, all these kind of things. These are dimensions of variation. These are sources of variation. If somebody's being more or less narrative, they'll have differences in their language use. And the idea of the dimensions is that these are these underlying kind of forces, stylistic forces, that affect a wide range of features. And so in this sort of register analysis approach, what they tend to do is measure lots of features, and then they look for a number of features that show similar patterns that go up and down together in their rates of use.
So just to recap a bit, so what we've got in this situation are news stories, right? So it falls into this narrative pattern. So in storytelling generally, and therefore in news stories, you might expect past tense, pronoun use, other things, and that marks out the register. But what your expectation is, and you test this later in the book, your expectation is that because the intent to deceive is different in the fake news articles, some of that basket of features is going to alter a bit. And the purpose in the experimental work is to find out how they alter. And then there's a sort of a question hanging over this. Can you use this difference to later on detect the difference between fake and real news? But I mean, you don't get as far as that in this piece of research. But that's a sort of a background question that I guess is there for me. So we're looking at the low-level language features, the amount of past tense, the amount of pronouns, and others, a whole basket of features, a whole lot of them. And we're saying this grouping of them suggests it's storytelling. And storytelling might be different for true stories than deceptive stories.
Yeah. I don't think storytelling is the main thing in these news articles per se. I mean, news articles do some storytelling, but they're also kind of informative too. But so the idea is that when a speaker or a language user has a different communicative intent, or they're in a different communicative situation. I mean, the situation here is fairly stable. They're writing news articles for the New York Times, but their intent changes, in particular from informing to maybe, if not deceiving, then misleading, or I guess maybe. But I was going to say something like not being caught.
Yes,
misleading, right? Like making stuff up, but not having anyone know that this kind of communicative intent difference should lead to a difference in language use. And that's what we find on all sorts of different dimensions of variation, dimensions of register variation, right? So if you're telling a story or you're giving instructions, there's major changes in your language use. If you're having a face-to-face conversation or a telephone conversation, there's differences in your language use. And so the idea here is that in all these cases, like, the speaker is aware that there's a difference, right? They know they're talking on the phone, they're talking face-to-face. They know if they're talking face-to-face that you share some visual frame of reference. If you're on the phone, you don't. So there's things you have to change. Yeah. And that this should then, or we know in most cases, this leads to, often small but real differences in language use. The point we try to make about false versus true news is that if the person knows it's false and true, then that should create a difference, right? So that's the deception part. But if they don't know, why would you expect a difference? Like, you could see this as an experiment where you have a journalist who has to write an article and you give them fake information and real information, and you don't tell them it's fake or real, and they're both plausible on the surface. One says there's 73% of people suffer from something, one says 72%, right? You don't expect any change in their language use. Like, without knowledge of there being some difference in the context, why would their language change?
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of set out the sort of groundwork, if you like. And I think now what we need to do is kind of get into the specifics of this case. So we're going to listen to a brief extract from one of the fake news stories. So this is false and dishonest. And then one of the real news stories. So that's true and honest. So the first one is an extract from a fake news story. So it's about the DC sniper. We heard about that in the case file. And this was first published in the New York Times on 25th of January 2003 under the headline, "Gun Tests Said to Bolster Sniper Case Against Two." So this is extract one.
The task force examining the sniper attacks that left 10 dead in the Washington area has uncovered fingerprints placing one defendant, John Mohammed, at the scene of one shooting, but still have little evidence suggesting he pulled the trigger in any of the killings, law enforcement officials said today.
And so here's an extract from a real news story published on the 12th of April 2003 under the headline, "Lawyers for Sniper Suspect Raise Issue of Chemical Exposure." And this is extract 2.
Defence lawyers filed an exhibit list that included orders filed at courts in Baltimore and Fairfax appointing defence lawyers and guardians.
So from those couple of extracts there's not much that stands out to the casual reader, but in the book you describe a list of different features which are more typical of fake news or real news stories, and we'll get into some of those in a moment. But the first thing we want to hear about really is, how did you start to identify those features? How did you go about that?
Yeah, so this picks up on Tim's question about Doug Biber's work. So these are features that have been developed in register analysis. We didn't really select them. These are ones that have a long history of use. They're mostly what we call part of speech categories, so things like nouns, verbs, maybe more finely subdivided, like past tense verbs, present tense verbs. And so there's just kind of a large set of these. Basically, if you went through a text and you took every word and defined its grammatical category, you just take all of those. So all the different features, it would encompass all the words in a text. So nouns, verbs, adjectives, things like that. A bit more finely divided, but that's the set.
And did you use a specific software program to
Yeah, we used Andrea Nini, who I think has been on the show, right?
Yeah.
And was a student of Tim and mine's. He's at Manchester now. We used his MAT tagger. But, effectively any part of speech tagger would work. So these are just tools that will go through and identify the parts of speech, the word classes, nouns, verbs. Those work. And I think probably in general, the kind of features we use in stylometry work too. So just like function words, just the, of, and, those would also get similar patterns.
Okay, so just to run over that. So a tagger, a computational tagger, is a piece of software that is a really common first step in any computational language analysis. And yes, it runs through and names the parts of speech. And then on top of that, you can categorize or structure those parts of speech. So we'd use things like parsers, which create the syntax trees, the grammar trees, or different categories. And you've mentioned function words there. So do you want to explain the difference between function words and other items in text?
Yeah, so function words are contrasted with content words. Content words are words like nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. These are words like, have a lot of content in a text. So if you look at a text, most of the long words will be content words. So things like time is a noun, or speak is a verb, red is an adjective, the color. And then function words are all these little words that, about half a text. Words like determiners, like the prepositions like of and to. Some verbs like is and have are considered function words. Will, could, modal verbs. Coordinators like and but. And so these texts, those function words are kind of like grammatical words, and in authorship analysis and stylometry, we often focus in on those and look at their relative frequencies. And, you could look at those show very similar patterns to
So good. So stylometry is just the measurement of stars. So from all this categorization that you get out of the tagger, you can then do word counts of different types of words and different classes of words and so on and so forth. And stylometry is measurements deriving from those counts, and they can be used in authorship analysis, as you said, and in this work. And so on top of that process of the automatic tagging and creating word classes of different groups, you then do a whole set of statistical analysis. Now, we're not going to get into the statistics you used in this podcast. People can download and read the book, and they can get more detail there. But basically, what those statistics show is that for a set of these features, there are differences between the two categories, the true news articles and those fake news articles. In my notes here, what I've got is that you found 49 separate features which had a difference across the fake and the real news stories. And your statistical methods that you used enabled you to label those differences as large differences, medium differences, small differences, and a set that you call negligible differences, and you discard those as there's not enough discrimination in those ones. So you have 28 of the 49 features which have non-negligible differences. Yeah. So can you give us a couple of the examples of those non-negligible differences?
I think we would say really quickly just what the measure is, and that's just so from the 30 or so fake news articles and the 30 or so real news articles, the question is just what percentage of one or the other kind of is higher in these feature counts than the other. What we do is for each of these features, we go through and we just see, are they predominantly more common or more frequent in his real news texts than his fake news texts, or vice versa, and the feature that is the most different, for example, which is actually a bit different than the other features, because most of the other features are sort of the frequency, the rate of use of some nouns or something. The feature that showed the most distinctiveness between his real and fake news was average word length. His average word length was longer in his real news and shorter in his fake news. So when he wrote fake news articles, he tended to use slightly shorter words. But these are really subtle differences, right? In his fake news, he was around 4.7 characters per word, so just under 5. And in his real news, it was 4.9. So these are tiny differences.
So I wanted to check up on this, Jack, because the difference you described was quite small. And so I had a look at the two extracts we've just heard, the fake news extract and the real news extract, and it follows this pattern. So the real news extract had an average word length of 5.8 characters in the words, and the fake news extract 5.1. So again, we see a small but real difference where the real news has longer words. And this got me wondering about, because you've said they're not very sort of linguistic features as such. And I wondered whether that seemed, in those two extracts at least, to be a greater frequency of function words in the fake news. And I think that's another of the features that you do see a difference in.
Yeah, it may be. I mean on a short extract, you probably almost had even odds of picking two extracts where it would have went the other way around. These are measurements at the text level, and like I said, we threw out ones that are under 300 words, and so now we're down in like 20 words or something, so we expect a lot of variance there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, overall, these are really like subtle differences. They almost must be, because this guy Jayson Blair was being, writing under much greater scrutiny than almost anyone else, than any of us ever have. And way more than regular people. These are carefully edited documents that were edited also, which would have flattened out differences to some extent. And he was also under a lot of suspicion for a while, so he was actually being scrutinized for this stuff. And so these are really subtle differences. A, there are a lot of them, and then B, getting back to your point about dimensions, they're not just 47 random features. These are 47 features that show consistent stylistic patterns when you look at them holistically. Yeah.
Okay, so as Tim mentioned there, average word length, I guess, is not a particularly linguistic feature. But there were other things, and there was something concerning pronoun use. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So in general, what we see is in his real news, he uses not just longer words, but he uses more nouns and more noun modification. So, like in English, or in languages in general, you often have a choice between using nouns or pronouns, right? So I can say something like, the man walked to the store, or he walked to the store, okay? And the man and he are both noun phrases, what we call noun phrases. And obviously, he's a lot shorter. And also, the man can be modified. You say something like, the man from Birmingham walked to the store, but you can't say he from Birmingham. You kind of can, but it's fairly odd. And so that's one of the main differences, right? So in general, he uses all of his pronouns, or almost all of his pronouns, more frequently in fake news, and he uses nouns, different types of nouns, and things that can modify nouns, especially things that come after a noun, post-modify it, we say, in his real news. And so, and this is a well-established pattern, one that we see in almost any corpus, even when it's not real and fake. What you'd usually see is that there's a difference between things that are, what we say, more informationally dense, where they've really packed a lot of information in. Obviously, if I say the man from Birmingham walked to the store, I'm giving you a lot more information than if I say he walked to the store. And so this is a big difference.
Okay, so we're going to play an extract here so listeners can kind of get an idea what it sort of sounds like to have these kind of frequent pronouns. So we've got, in this extract, we've got it and them, and then a demonstrative pronoun this, all in a very short stretch.
But people are often surprised by how it takes a hold of them. Everyone is human. It can't help but take an effect on people when they're seeing things like this and seeing it in numbers like this.
So we've got all the it and the thems and the this. So that's kind of just to give you a taste of what it sounds like.
And that's an extract from the fake news.
Yes, that's from the fake news.
So we've talked through a few features, Jack, that were different across the real and the fake. Are there any that you'd like to pick out?
A big point here is that none of these are, like that average word length difference was like 0.2 characters on average or something. This is tiny. And these things, like obviously any news text will have tons of pronouns in it. Both Blair's real and fake news had lots of pronouns, had lots of nouns, had lots of verbs. These are all things that you can't avoid. And these are really small differences, small quantitative differences in their rates of occurrence. There was one feature that popped out, though, that was almost absolute. So it was a feature that actually, in all but one case, only occurred in his fake news. And it's related to quotes. And so normally what we find, these are called public verbs in like in register analysis. These are words like say, to report, to claim. So these are, when you're like giving a quote, for example. And what we found was Blair had a really clear difference based on the tense in which he used the verb to say. So say is obviously a very common verb in newspaper articles. You use it all the time. It's sort of the unmarked and formal way of giving a quotation, both a direct quotation and an indirect quotation. And so what we found is that when Blair used said, past tense say, you do this both in real and fake news. There was a bit of a preference for it in real news, but nothing major. But when he used the word say in the present tense, like the doctor says, he used that almost exclusively in fake news. So when he was in the present tense, not in the past tense, reporting quotes, especially, if he used the word say, it was almost a clear marker of him lying. The one time he does use say in real news, if I recall, it was also not a direct quote. It was like a reporting what was in a report or something like that. So it was a really clear one. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Like if you say like, he said he would be here, then that's somewhat more firm than if you say he says he'll be here, like just in regular language, right? Like if you say, oh, he says he'll be here, that expresses some doubt that he might not be there. He said he'd be here is more definitive. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's odd in newspaper writing to use the present tense, obviously the past tense, because you're reporting on quotes that you have had previously, you're sort of marking them as in the past, that you observed them. And so that was a real marker. That was the single most sort of distinctive feature. It's not a great feature in the sense that he would use said in both. Yeah. And, many of, I don't remember the exact numbers here, but, a substantial number of his fake news articles never used the word say. But when he uses it, it was a fake news in all but one case.
So there's got to be a reason to have a quotation, and then it gives the opportunity for the feature to arise. And then some other times,
and then you have to take it.
Then you have to take that opportunity.
Because there's tons of quotations in both.
So you can see you've talked a bit about the scrutiny that he was under and the editorial process and as suspicion raised. So these features are really fine-grained. They're statistically important, big differences, and you've shown that through your statistics.
Or real differences. I wouldn't even say they're big in the most cases.
Real, yes. Real differences. But you can see why people reading the newspaper didn't say, this sounds odd, this sounds wrong. It took an accusation of plagiarism, a different sort of language crime, for the investigation to start and the fact-checking and the rest of it. The language itself didn't give him away.
No. That's. I mean, the content of the language gave him away, but not the style of the language.
Not the style. Uh-huh. Yeah,
that's right.
So if we go back to this idea of register variation that we've talked about before, and particularly communicative intent, so the fact that with honest compared to dishonest writing, the author's intent is different there. How do these features that you've just been talking about, how do those differences relate to these differences in communicative intent?
So with things like say, and other ones too, like, hedges. So these are like downplaying what you're saying, the marking of sort of lack of certainty. So these seem to be something of a leak that he knows he's lying. And therefore he inadvertently, puts it in the present tense, the verb said, not purposely, of course, one wouldn't think, but just as an inadvertent kind of leak on what he knows. He's not so confident in it. And so he's obviously not saying explicitly that he doesn't believe these things to be true, but he couldn't help himself but to slightly more or less of the features that are associated with normal news writing. You know, that's clearly related to him knowing that he wasn't, or seems to be clearly related to him knowing that he wasn't telling the truth. But then the features around like nouns and pronouns is different. And so I don't think it's direct evidence that he was shifting his speech because he was lying. In this case, I think it reflects two things. So on the one hand, he doesn't have real information to give. So he's concocting information or bringing information from outside sources and pretending that he did it. And so he's presumably motivated to not get caught. And so every time he needs to make up a lie, that's more information he needs to incorporate into these newspaper articles, which are sort of a set length, right? Mm-hmm. And so by making it more and more dense, by using nouns, by using noun modification, by avoiding pronouns, these things lead to like longer articles. Like the more pronouns you use to convey the same information, you'll need more text. And so one thing that was happening there was that because he didn't have actual information to provide, because that wasn't really his goal was to produce a newspaper article as quickly as he could, that he doesn't want to pack in the information because that would just force him to come up with more information to pack in. So on the one hand, you get these less dense, fewer nouns, more pronouns because he doesn't have information to share. He also doesn't want to give too much information or it would be more obvious that he'd have more chance of being caught. The second thing that was happening, and I think this is probably the main thing actually, we know why he was writing fake news. He wasn't writing fake news to deceive people. That wasn't his main goal. He knew he was deceiving people. He knew that was the effect of what he was doing, giving information that wasn't true. But his main goal was to just write as many articles as he could. He was financially incentivized here. The more articles he wrote, the more money he got, the quicker he would move up the ranks. And so the real thing that was motivating him in his fake news was to write as quickly as he could, produce as many articles as he could. And as anyone who writes knows, like it takes time to edit texts. And the main thing we do when we edit texts, at least when we're worried about text length, is to compress it and make it as informationally dense as possible. And so when he was lying, he didn't have time to do that. And so those two factors, one, he didn't want to give too much information because he was making it up, and two, he didn't have enough time to really edit it carefully to pack in the information is what explains those patterns. So in the book, we reach this conclusion. It's a quote from the book. When Blair is telling the truth, he writes with detail and certainty. When he is lying, he consciously or unconsciously becomes less specific, making it difficult to interrogate or question the information he is sharing, ultimately resulting in a less confident and transparent style of reporting.
Yeah, so that's the overall conclusion. That's how these features sort of accumulate into an overall feature set. This information density and this certainty are what characterize the fake from the real news. Now, I know that when the book was published a couple of years ago, you got a lot of attention because it's a big news story of itself. And you actually had a little interaction with Jayson Blair online, I think, on social media, didn't you?
Yeah.
And so can you just tell us a little bit about this? What did he say about your analysis?
Yeah,
did he validate it?
Yeah, no, there's not that much to say. So I found him on Twitter.
Yeah.
And I direct messaged him with a link to the book.
Okay.
And he said thank you, I think. He was... Jayson Blair himself wrote a book about this and had admitted all this. He's now, I think, he was doing some kind of like coaching and like public speaking and stuff.
Okay.
So I don't think he minded.
So he's not shy of his past in this. Not proud of it maybe, but he's written about it too.
Yeah, no, I think he speaks about it. So no, I don't think he had any issues with it. But we didn't get any further feedback from him. Okay. We also didn't get any further feedback from the New York Times. It's worth saying either.
It would be nice.
We did send it around to the New York Times.
I'm sure you did.
We had, in the book, there's quite a detailed explanation of the background, and that took a lot of research, including talking to people at the New York Times.
Yeah, and I think the impression I got from rereading it recently in preparing the podcast was that this is on Jayson Blair, and you don't make excuses for Jayson Blair, but there's also culpability from the editing team and the processes within the newspaper that allowed this, young reporter. There wasn't sufficient sort of positive management of them and putting him under pressure and so on. You walk a line there saying that this could have been picked up earlier by the newspaper, or that the management in the newspaper might have acted differently, do you think?
Yeah, there was lots of... there was a couple of editors who were really... they monitor people's correction rates pretty carefully.
Yeah.
And so he had a high correction rate. was considered misinformation, right? So these
Yeah.
are inadvertent errors he had made, but he had a high one, which I think is taken to speak to generally of sloppiness, not of deception. But there was people who were concerned. But what was happening at the New York Times? I mean, I think they've changed it was a controversial policy at the time, but this is right around the time that online news was on the rise, right?
Yeah.
And so they were really worried. Obviously, some of these newspapers, like the New York Times, have been pretty successful in surviving this. But at the time, they were really worried about it, and so they were really made a really competitive newsroom where they would send lots of reporters to the same case, and they would compete with each other. They would compete both in quantity and quality of news, and this seemed to encourage Jayson Blair to both write more news than he had, so to fabricate news, and to make it more salacious and more exciting. The examples you guys gave before of the real and fake news had, there wasn't much difference there. The one with the 5.8 versus 5.1 on the words, but you might go back and look at it, and it had, in the one he talks about the lawyers. In the true one, he talks about the lawyers, the defense lawyers. Like, those are actual people, right? Like, there's not that many of them. In the fake one, he talks about law enforcement officers, or something like that, right? I can't remember the exact verbiage, but, that's a very broadly defined group of people that you could never, which one was it? And who are they? They're not even listed anywhere, right? So I think that was the kind of thing that was happening a lot. And that's one of the ways he would hide these, by these sort of not very traceable quotations and claims.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that a linguistic approach like the one that you've taken here, could that kind of contribute to fake news detection, where they're we're obviously people are trying to develop screening systems and kind of make judgments where if there is a suspected case of fake news? Do you think this could contribute to that?
Yeah, I think it could contribute. I mean, one of the points we make in the book is that there's been a lot of assumptions that there's a difference between real and fake news, but without any real evidence of it. And that this goes back a lot to the problems with the data, where they might have like a bunch of blogs as fake news and a bunch of New York Times articles as real news, and they can tell the difference very easily, as anybody could, because they look different. And then this is ascribed to be a difference between real and fake news, but it's probably a different type of register variation. And so I think what we do in this book is show that there is real linguistic differences between real and fake news, at least of this type of deceptive fake news. And so I think in that case, it's good evidence that NLP and people doing deception detection and forensic linguistics can say, look, well, there's differences, and these are things that we could possibly pick up on. So in that sense, I think it's positive in that angle. On the other hand, these are very subtle differences. They're not differences that are absolute in any way. There's a lot of overlap in those features. And so although we see, like, scientifically that there's a difference, I think it's pretty sobering about the ability of these techniques to be used, to flag individual articles that are real or fake. And I think also what we show, like, the main difference here is between these more dense and less dense text, where the more dense ones are real and the less dense ones are fake. Now, this makes sense in the context of Blair, because we know that he was writing news to write news as much as he could, right? And so, like I said, when he's has lots of time and he's telling the truth, he compresses it because he wants to pack a lot of information in, because he's taking his time to be a good journalist. And when he was faking news, he was writing them very quickly. But of course, other types of fake news might be very carefully written. In fact, if you think about, like, some kind of political fake news that's designed to really trick people, you could see how that might be constructed much more carefully than a real news article. Like, that might take weeks and months to make. In that case, you would expect the opposite. So I think, what we show is that there's a difference, but we also show how this is really linked to the variation in the context and in the purpose of the author. And that, I don't think you would assume that would be consistent.
And I suppose there's always a question of what would you compare it to? I mean, in this case, you had the two sets and you could make those kind of direct comparisons, but I suppose that's not always going to necessarily be the case in the wild.
Well, you also have this really good baseline, right, which almost never exists, right? Like, I suppose if, like, you guys opened the interview saying, like, this wasn't a forensic case, but it maybe could have been. And you could see how if the New York Times had come to linguists in the middle of that investigation they were doing, and if they had, this wouldn't have been the case because they suspended Blair immediately, but if they had let him keep going, that one could do this analysis and try to project Blair forward. So I think what we get in the end here is that, we should expect differences between a journalist telling the truth and lying, but we shouldn't expect it to be the same features. I think that is a makes it hard to do general deception detection, or throws a wrench into that idea.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's a really nice, naturally occurring experiment where you can show the differences between the two groups. But it's a single case. It's a single individual. And the question of would other individuals faced with the same pressures use different strategies to produce their fake news? I think Isabel Picanel's work talks about strategies for deception can vary. And so one person might be vague and produce a lot of words, and another person might say very little to produce the same deceptive effect. And similarly, you could see one journalist in a pressured, busy newsroom finds a way of overproducing and through fake news through one strategy, and another journalist a different strategy. And so although the communicative intent is the same, they find different ways to achieve that. And I think that's a possibility as well, why it may not generalize.
Yeah, I mean, I think any journalist who has, say, 2 hours less to write their article would write a less dense article.
Yeah.
But that maybe isn't because, that would be because they're lying.
No.
Right? And so there's also, to flip it around, there's other things that could explain these differences in another author.
Yeah.
I do think there is some potential here. So I think the other pattern around sort of expression of conviction, like with say versus says and those kind of features. I mean, we've done other research now. It's done with Bashar Baisa's PhD dissertation. She's now at professor at Taif University in Saudi Arabia, and with Matteo Fuoli, who's a colleague we were supervising. And we looked at false and real news, and we find these kind of stance features, not always in the same direction, but kind of unusual marking of stance. So marking something as opinion in general seems to be, across different data sets, something that does identify in the news deception. So the more that you do stance in an unusual way, the more you mark stance. And in this case, it was removing stance, so not marking things as opinion. This maybe is a feature that is more consistent, whereas pressure to write something quickly is not a general driver of the production of fake news that would always occur. You can see how acknowledging or knowing something is opinion when it's not opinion, or presenting something as fact that you don't believe is fact, you could have a more kind of general effect on language around use of stance markers, but in different directions too. So in that data set, there was the false news that had fewer stance markers because they were trying to hide the fact that it was not established information.
It's an interesting point. I think we need to wrap it up there. So thank you so much, Jack, for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a really great discussion, really interesting.
Thank you.
So if you've got a question, remember you can get in touch with the show via email. We're writingwrongs@aston.ac.uk.
If you'd like to read Jack's book, it's freely available to download, and the link is in the episode description.
This has been Writing Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.